Hey, my name is Heath Arensen. I'm excited to be giving the keynote today on a subject hopefully you'll all find very interesting. It's open source, which of course we all love, but it's a way of looking at open source a little bit differently. So I work for the UN Foundation's Digital Impact Alliance, and we've been working for the last 3 years to really kind of think about how should the greater UN system, social good organizations, large international NGOs and donors, how should they think about supporting open source, and really what is the promise that open source has in all of the kind of technical developments and trends that we've seen in open source. How can we kind of harness those for social good? So I think it's a very interesting conversation because it ties together a lot of all of our interests. It ties together, a passion for open source, a passion for technology, but also ties into social good. What can we do to make the world a better place? So we're going to just share a little bit about what makes these types of software projects a little bit different. What makes them worth supporting? Should we even support them? What does it look like? And then we'll kind of go into some details of what we as an organization have begun to do to begin to maintain and work towards sustainability of these projects. And while you might be coming from an infrastructure project or working with something kind of in the middle of a tech stack, this might not feel as relevant, but it is relevant. It is very interesting. And then kind of at the end, we're going to just kind of look towards the future and say, what does it look like for governments to look at their their critical infrastructure, not just their infrastructure, but all the applications that they use, and be able to kind of share that across municipal governments, city governments, national governments, internationally. Can we start to look at applications as open sourced shared value tools that can be through community supported, etc. So again, thanks for the opportunity to be able to share today. I'll be here during the presentation through the chat. Very happy to kind of address questions as we go along. So open source software is widely used by governments and programs that are addressing the sustainable development goals. So the UN system uses the sustainable development goals to kind of give us as countries a target for a number of objectives in international development, things that we want to see as being better. So open source has a lot of promise. Open source promises things. It says, like, we can build something, we can share something, we can give it freely, and this is particularly appealing to those in the social sector and those in government. So this idea of public money, public code, it makes sense, it's logical. If we invest in developing new software, if that is using taxpayer money, we're building something, it makes sense that it should not be proprietary. And if it was proprietary, who would own it and who would control it? So there has been, for many years, this notion that in the public sector we should be embracing open source. And we work specifically in the international development sector. And with international donors who are supporting, governments and social good organizations, and have embraced, open source for many years because of its promise. So in this program, we're going to jump back and forth between just looking at the idea of open source and this term digital public goods. So digital public goods is a term we started to use in the last year or two to really kind of define kind of clearly this class of open source products that we're talking about. And it really kind of captures this idea, very good of like, what we are trying to create are these large shared applications that are a public good. And in many ways, their funding comes from public funds. And so that's a word that we're going to kind of use between this. There's a real movement inside of the UN system to not only create software to accelerate social change, but to really invest in open source. And so right up at the very top, the UN Secretary General has put out this year his roadmap for digital cooperation. And their very first recommendation was for the creation of an alliance to support digital public goods. And so there's a number of organizations, some that we work with very closely, that we collaborate with, that are working towards making this a reality. So we put up here on the slide a number of these digital public goods. You may recognize them, you might not, but it's definitely worth taking a look, Googling around, getting to know them. These are outstanding projects that are doing great things, and there might be ways for you to volunteer and contribute to them. So despite the investments in open source in the international development sector, they've struggled, and they've struggled for a number of reasons. And so the unit that I work for, the Open Source Center at the Digital Impact Alliance, was set up, it was imagined about 5 years ago, but we've been operating for about 3. And it was set up just to be able to think about these problems that the projects are struggling with. And if you think about it, it's intuitive why these projects are struggling. The starting place is they're big. They're surprisingly large. Very often they're applications that were created for a social mission. So let's imagine, for example, there's a problem. The country of Ethiopia needs a software system to manage their immunization supply chain. Like, great, okay, well let's go and see what software kind of exists out there that could do this. And there's nothing really off the shelf that you could take. So okay, we got to build our own. Let's take some open source tools, let's build on them, let's create this application. And this application is for immunization supply chain. So we built it for one country. This is where the problem begins to start. And it was actually a pretty big investment, a pretty nice piece of software. But really, at this point, all it actually is custom application, is a custom software. It's been built. They may slap a license onto it, but it's not documented. There's no community. It's not shared. And this is kind of our starting point. So what's been happening is now another country comes and says, we would like to also have immunization supply chain software. To manage our product. So we got a whole other, the country of Indonesia, for example. So we want to do the same thing. So what do? They build it too, and another country builds it too. So all these countries are building the same thing over and over. So there's a lack of coordination saying, you know what? We already built it over there. We already built it over there. So that's kind of a starting point of the problem, is that things are being built over and over and over. And I wouldn't even say that they're really open source until a community has formed and it's kind of shared widely and broadly. But because these are applications, and they're very customized applications, and because they need more than just technical. So in the case of immunization supply chain software, you need somebody in the country talking to the governments, helping them configure it, talking to doctors and nurses and the pharmaceutical companies. Who does all that? Who owns this? Does this vision really work, where we can mix the ideas of open source software with all the other things that it needs? There's no surprise it is a problem. However, if we can solve this, if we can figure out how to take all these lessons that we've learned in open source, expand them a little bit more widely to take on the other organizational activities that need to happen to make them really thrive, we can do some great things. And this is where I see a whole new class of products kind of coming out there that are that can be competitive with proprietary systems, and it can kind of unlock sharing between governments. So that's what we're working on. But right now, here's the status. The World Bank says only 13% of public sector ICT projects in developing countries are successful, and most fail because of lack of money. There's other problems as well, like no real kind of community governance takes place for the open source project to really get going. And it's unclear who owns it. And we'll look into that a little bit deeper. So from our point of view, the projects that our center looks to support, is very important to kind of see, where do we kind of put our focus? And so we've basically done two things. So if you look over on the right on the slide, we have what we call foundational open source. You know all these projects. They are used by all of us as the foundational building blocks of so many open source projects and applications. That's not who we work with. We feel like they're important. We use them. We cheer for them. But that's not our focus. If you look over at the left, we begin to see the types of projects that we work with. So, by and large, they're applications, complete end-to-end applications, and they're very directly focused on a social objective, which we define as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so when we look at a project, we basically kind of map it out and say, how mature is it in terms of its ability to sustain itself, maintain, make money, etc. And then how focused is it explicitly on the SDGs. And you look at the orange in the middle, that's kind of like our sweet spot, which we call the Digital Public Goods Foundation, the idea of an accelerator. That's where we kind of put a lot of our focus. Over on the right are projects that we would care about, but they're a little bit further along. They've pretty much figured out their own sustainability, often with a partnership with an organization that can play some functions and roles around financing and activities. We also don't work in innovation, so we don't care a lot about brand new things. We think they're important, but there's so many of them come in, and there's there's hackathons and accelerators and innovation funds and all sorts of things that can bring things into the world. What we really kind of focus on are those that do exist and are struggling. So just to kind of give a snapshot of what kind of projects we're talking about, what do they do? So I'll just kind of read these off kind of quickly. And again, I encourage you to take some time, research them, find ways to connect with them. Many of them have gone through the work of being able to take volunteer contributions, and they're always looking to kind of grow the community. So, Primero is a great project that we work with very closely. That works in child protection, social services. Open MRS is one of the larger digital public goods, very well known, focused on medical records. They have a very robust community globally. Moja Global, for those of you who are interested in climate change, they have an outstanding land management tool called Flint, which is in the Linux Foundation, and is a really outstanding project if you're interested in that. MIFOS focused on banking, everything from microfinance banks to larger banks who are looking for a core banking system built in open source. They're tied into the Fineract program at the Apache Foundation. Mojaloop, which is a new and very exciting, very interesting. If you're into crypto, sometimes it's a little bit interesting, but it's a payment settlement platform that allows for movement of money between national banks and mobile network operators, with a lot of focus right now in Africa. ODK is very well known, used a lot for data collection. DHIS2 is probably the largest digital public good. It's been supported at the University of Oslo for a very long time, focused on health information. Civil registration, Open CRVS, really important system being developed to be able to, so many countries don't have birth records, just basic records. So it's a system for them to be able to do that. Open LMIS, we'll take a little bit of a deeper look in that as we go along. But they pharmaceutical supply chain and MOSIP, national ID. So this is just a kind of a snapshot of some of the projects that are out there. But thinking about where these projects start, where they begin, is very, very important because it's different than other open source. So most open source, you've heard like, you scratch an itch or you start it in the garage. It's very often this image of, one person solving their technical challenge. And then others saying, oh, that's useful because it solves my challenge too. And then they begin to collaborate, community starts, and it builds from there. This is very different because it doesn't start with a technical need, and very often it doesn't start with a technical person. It starts with a social objective. It starts with a social need. And very often coming out of a large nonprofit, they say, we need to solve X problem, and we find that a digital tool focused on this will help us get there faster. So that's how these ideas start, and then they go out and they look for money to fund it. So this is not the startup world. This is not VC money. It's not even volunteer. It's looking for large grants to be able to fund the initial development of these projects. And then they start. And almost always, it might seem like a strange thing, but they almost always start inside of universities and nonprofits. It might seem strange, but it actually makes a lot of sense, because those two types of organizations, number one, are focused on social good. Number two, they are able to accept large grants and donations. This is one of the things that is probably most important in this sector, is that those who are giving large amounts of international money have very strict audit requirements that most organizations just don't have the capability and the capacity to be able to process. And so universities, large NGOs are able to process them. So then they start to build it, they put it on the market, they test it, they release it under an open source license, everything is going well. A community begins to form, commercial partners say, hey, this is useful, let me build some value on top of that. It begins to grow, they don't necessarily contribute back. And then we find ourselves in the valley of death. So the valley of death is something that's, a phrase that's commonly used in startup investing, etc. We look at it a little bit differently. So we look at it as the point when the grant funding is beginning to dry up. Nobody wants to grant something forever. They see it as a initial investment, a catalyst for growth. But that grant money is not going to stay along forever. The problem is this is not a business, it's not a startup. And so the money doesn't follow with it. Very often the initial developers are being paid. Because it started inside of a nonprofit, they paid an external company to build it. And that external company is not as invested as an open source community might be. So then we find these projects, they've run out of money. Those who have built it are not active contributors inside of the community, and they really kind of struggle to meet scale. So what do we do with that? So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. That's kind of the world that we find ourselves in. Let's look at the same thing, but looking at the project OpenLMIS, just to give a real kind of snapshot into what an organization like this would look like. So there is a need in Africa for supply chain systems to move healthcare pharmaceuticals. A lot of large nonprofits are in the health space. They're having to move goods to where people are. And a number of organizations found that they were working on the same problem and could not find an off-the-shelf solution, and were beginning to build their own. This is where their kind of first success started. They said, instead of us each building our own, why don't we build something in common? And so, so a number of organizations, kind of led by, Rockefeller, USAID, and Gates said, hey, we're going to throw some money at this. And then others, Chemonics, ThoughtWorks, Path, Chai, and an organization called Village Reach said, we're going to all collaborate on this together, and we're going to build, a common tool. So far so good. Village Reach, an NGO based out of Seattle, was able to accept funding, was able to pay the developers, was able to build a product and kind of bring it out to market. Again, shared it under an open source license. A community began to form who are doing implementation, so country level implementation, several $1 million per implementation. So there's some value there for the consultants who are implementing it. And then very common is, it's been out in the market place for a little while. People are using it. Time for a rebuild. So there's still some money around. They come back, they rebuild it, and they release a really pretty great and outstanding product into the marketplace. However, it's not a marketplace that has payers. It was not organized in the beginning to think about how would somebody pay for this. And if you're coming from the open source world, even the concept of paying for something, what would they pay for? Well, there are costs, but are there the technical costs? What costs are they? So OpenLMIS finds himself in this really kind of interesting place where they created a great product. It's out there in the world doing great things. They've created a very robust community, but they don't know how to sustain themselves. So that's the kind of thing we're going to look at today, is how do we sustain these types of projects? And again, it's the open source plus other things, and the other things can sometimes be the more costly thing and the more challenging to support. So how many of these projects are out there? The honest truth is we don't know. We work at the Open Source Center with about 40 of them. We've tried to make an exhaustive list. We have 134 on that list. But the real reality is that there, for however many there are today, if we can find a way to really sustain them, a lot more will kind of come to the table. And what I mean is that, as we said in the beginning, there's been investments in building custom software by organizations for social change. But like most custom software that's built there, it's just there, it's inside of that organization. So how do we, if we came and said like, hey, give us that software, and let's turn it into a digital public good. And then instead of you having your annual cost to maintain that, you can just kind of share that across other organizations. So that's something that we're actively working on. And we think it'll lead to a much greater number of projects. And then we also want to see is like how valuable are these things? Like, how big is it? So like $76 million, what is that? So that's using a method of looking at lines of code to see the value that's created in one digital public good. $76 million. How much money did it take to kind of get it to that value? About $10 million. So the donors invested about $10 million. Very close to a 10x, increase in value because of the volunteers that have been able to come. But that's just kind of giving you a sense of scale of what size some of these projects are. There's a lot of different types of open source projects. When we're looking at applications in our sector, really kind of two main types kind of emerge, right? And most of us kind of understand how these are different. So the first is a single trusted vendor, and the second is like a true community open source project. So in the single trusted vendor, there's one organization. Usually it's figured out a way to build some value on top of it, SaaS or a consulting model or some kind of model that they built on top of the open source. When we talk about open source business models, very often they're a trusted vendor. While the software is free for anybody to pick up and build on, really there's only one real organization that's kind of setting the vision, leading the governments, the roadmap, etc. So we see a lot of that. On the other side, there's community open source. So community open source is really what we want. We really want to have this, neutral, decentralized, free, and a community that's vibrant. And maybe there'll be different versions of it, but we will have this true kind of shared, common digital public good. That's really what we want. So what's keeping projects from doing that? And I don't think this is true just in the international development space. I think it's true globally in open source. When a business model is kind of necessary to kind of move the size of because of the size of the project and the non-technical things that have to happen for its success, most common in applications, not infrastructure, a single trusted vendor is a little bit more common because they can have a business, a startup, they can build money on top of it. And so a question we're starting to ask is that good? Is that okay? Or is there another way that we can find to maintain and sustain these core open source projects, these digital public goods, which will allow them to remain community driven? And we think if we can achieve that, we'll be much better off. So as we know, open source relies on a diverse community. It's not really owned by one organization, entity, person, etc. While the intellectual property might be held, a community-led organization really does have a diverse set of stakeholders, and common to sustain, and their identification of who are these stakeholders. We use the maintainers, contributors, sustainers, and consumers as the different kind of players who are involved. In our space, there's a couple of organizations who are playing a coordinating role. There's not a dedicated software foundation for digital public goods. We think there should be one. A lot of the rest of my presentation will be the argument for one. But in the meantime, there's ourselves, an organization called Digital Square, which is focused on health, and the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which is looking at kind of building an alliance of all the digital public goods and those who are invested in together. Very, very good effort. So looking back at us, like what do we do at the Open Source Center? What are we doing to try to make these projects stronger, more sustainable? So this is what we do. When we started, we're like, they need help. So we're going to do two things. One is we're going to kind of work very deeply with some individual projects to learn as much as we can in sustaining them, so consulting, advising, etc. We're going to kind of connect them into mentor programs. So, very active as an umbrella organization instead of Google Summer of Code. That's been outstanding. Our projects who have been unable to kind of easily bring on volunteers after they go through the program are now able to have start to build a volunteer community. We give small grants. So we start with a fund where we could give grants. These grants are very kind of focused on identifying ways that we can help the projects kind of work together, create interoperability, document their code, just anything to kind of make it more shareable. Very often things that would be kind of a little bit lower on their priority list internally, but from the point of view of others who might be using it, would be of high value. So in the last 3 years as we've been working, we've learned a lot of things by going really deep. At the same time, we've been trying to take a high-level view of all of the kind of digital public goods that are out there. What do they universally need? And we're kind of moving those two things. And in both, we're starting to coalesce on this idea of the need for a software foundation for digital public goods. Then the question is, well, why? There's existing fiscal sponsors out there. Why wouldn't we use those? Well, the answer is, a lot of our projects should go join those fiscal sponsors. But what we're trying to really kind of get at is to say that there's things beyond just the technical or just the governance that these projects need, and having an organization that can take on more of them. So we're using the word foundation for lack of a better word. There needs to be something, and we'll get deeper into what that something is. So again, this is how we work. If you guys know of any kind of digital public goods, we'd love to get to know them. We'd love to kind of bring them on as members. Membership in the Open Source Center is very simple. It's just about getting on our mailing list, participating in our forums. Once you're kind of in, we just kind of make sure that you are, generally fit the criteria. Then you have the ability to apply to grants, apply to Google Summer of Code, etc. So I'll show at the end, ways that you can kind of get in contact with us. But one of the things that we do, and we've really become a lot more systematic in how we do that, is our consulting for sustainability. And so in that, we now have a workbook that has a number of workshops that we kind of work through that first kind of evaluates the project on like a maturity model, and then moves into most of the work actually has to do around financial models. What are the different revenue streams that might be able to support this project? Can they go through this organization, or how do the different community members all kind of fit together so that revenue is being generated and either volunteer contributions or money is able to flow back to the kind of core project. So consulting is still a big part of what we do at the Open Source Center. Again, we give grants. We're actively raising money for our grant pool. So if anybody is interested, it happens to come from an organization that's figuring out how do we give to open source. I think we're becoming very opinionated about how we give money, how we prioritize features and tasks, and then how we fund them. And then again, we run these support programs for projects. So let's take a step back and look at these digital public goods. And we found it's very helpful to kind of look at them in their different growth phases. And so we've got the 4 main phases. You start in the idea phase, move into an innovation phase, and there's the growth, and then the mature phase. And the hardest thing to do is to move from the innovation phase into the growth phase. So idea phase is fun. That's when you just have an idea, right? And everybody loves good ideas. We come up with them. In our organization inside of Dial, we are the stewards of what's called the Principles for Digital Development, which is kind of a set of best practice design principles for when you start a new kind of digital initiative that targets a social outcome. It's a very good starting point to make sure you start at the beginning. Then is the innovation phase. The innovation phase is fun. It's where you get to experiment. It's when you get to fail. That's where I say, oh, you get to fail fast. Let's build something. Let's try it. Let's iterate it. So if you're working in innovation, that's kind of, it's fun and it's exciting. The real hard thing to do is to move something out of innovation and into growth and then into maturity. So our focus has not been on innovation. We're like, get your act together, prove out a model, build something. And there's a lot of support organizations that help in innovation, et cetera. We're much more focused on how do we bring something to scale, and in bringing it to scale, how do we create those support structures that are really kind of necessary for it to be maintained in the long run. And so more than we look at open source, sometimes we look at big tech to say like, how well, big tech has software and they know how to maintain it. How do they maintain it? They maintain it by having budgets for it, by going out and having certifications, networks of developers. We try to think of all the different things that are necessary to really keep a software project good and healthy, and say how can we replicate that while keeping the open source core, while keeping the neutrality, but still recognizing that money, and sometimes a lot of money, has to flow through this project in order for it to really successfully accomplish its social mission. So these are the things that we're really starting to think about. And for our types of projects, we've kind of identified 5 things that we feel are really important for them to thrive. So when we work with a project, we sit down with them and they say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And you need to identify how these things will get done if you want to even have the baseline for being able to thrive. So the first is a fiscal home. You need to have some kind of a legal organization that can hold the IP, enter into contracts, hire people, etc. The fiscal sponsors that are available can do these things. But so many organizations or projects that we're working with, because they started inside of that university or that nonprofit, that organization is wanting to, like they use the words all that, spin it off. We're not a software company. We don't want to hold this long enough. We can't run a business. Like we can't do this stuff. We want to spin it off. And so projects are coming to us in that state. So they're struggling. They need to be spun off. Their founding organization is no longer interested in them. And so we really have to identify, well, what fiscal home? Who will play that fiscal role? The second is related. It's actually the vision. Who will be the primary maintainer? We found that if there's not like somebody kind of stepping up to the plate saying like, we own this vision, we're moving towards it, we're going, it's going to be a lot harder. So we identify who's going to kind of lead the community governance, who's going to kind of develop all the systems, the tools, and the processes, the community, like the product roadmap, etc. We need to identify who that's going to be. The next is a dedicated product team. This is actually fairly important, and it comes with how these projects were started. Again, they weren't started by passionate volunteers who said, I believe in building this, and they stay with the project. They were very often contracted out to companies that just did the work for hire. And what ends up happening is, because these projects are sometimes quite large, having developers who know the project, who are engaged in the project, is very challenging. And what we found is that if you can at least find a way to have a small dedicated product team, maybe a community manager, an architect, some developers, just a very core team, then you can be able to unlock a whole bunch more in terms of volunteer contribution, etc. And so that's something that we go a little bit deeper into than maybe an infrastructure open source project might have, that could rely on a community to be able to contribute a little bit more. The other is access to core funding. You need to know where your money's coming from, and it has to be pretty reliable. And the reason is that governments are taking on these projects. They're saying like, I have to procure software for, like, let's say my national ID system. And so there's a whole bunch of proprietary systems that are out there that says, yeah, we'll sell it to you and we'll support it and it's going to cost X. And then we say, oh, there's an open source solution and it's good. It's really good. how can they select that if they do not know that it's going to be sustained, that there's going to be future releases, that there's going to be support if something breaks, somebody can come and take it. All of those things need to be built. It's much harder in a kind of community open source kind of environment to be able to do that. So starting with like identifying where's that money going to come from, and that's a challenge. It could be from revenue, it could be from organizations that have committed long-term grant funding to them. And then the last is a community of practice. We should all learn from each other. There's a lot of us who are building similar things. We should learn from each other. Here's a little bit of a kind of a deep look into how we're trying to think about those kind of core maintaining costs. And so we've kind of broken down like what are the different costs that might kind of come into a digital public good. So the top of the purple are what we call community created value. So these are usually like consultants or SaaS companies, anybody who's kind of using that software, building some business of it, some commercial revenue. And these can be, quite big. So that's the, most money that's going to flow into the project is flowing to those. The challenge there is that money doesn't flow then back to the core project if the project needs money. The hope in good governance is that some money might flow back, some contributions might flow back. But what we found is that there's a lot of free riders. This is a challenge in markets where there might be some commercial value, but yet there's not really enough. There's just kind of a competition for very scarce resources. And then maintaining the core becomes a lot more challenging. So then, down at the bottom of the slide, we look at the core. We have something called operational support. Those are kind of like the non-technical things that are necessary just to kind of keep that thing running. Core maintenance is like the basic minimum technical investment we could do on a year-to-year just to kind of keep it up to date, building out the releases, and then above that, a feature backlog. And so what we've tried to do is just say like, what's the minimum that we can look at, and why this is important is that if we can figure out how to support the core, if we can figure out how to support the minimum, we can maintain the community nature of it. They're less likely to have to revert to a single vendor, open source business model, etc. And so we're putting together this vision where we say like, the international donor community who has invested in these projects should continue to invest in them at least at this minimum level, because this is the minimum viable that we can really guarantee that this project will be available for governments. People can pick it up and use it. It will be supported, and we can build value on top of that. And once we have that core, if we can have a very robust community growing and scaling over time, there will be more contributions back, both in terms of money and code. We'll take a little bit of look at how we're doing this. So we actually do think that we have to put together teams. They don't necessarily have to be in one organization. It could be distributed and it could be made up of volunteers, but you got to identify them. You got to say there is a core team and they're really important for this project. And by having them, making sure that they are, maybe, and this might feel like it's kind of, against some of the ethos of open source, and we don't understand the challenges there. But there needs to be at least a core that can reliably get paid each month and can contribute to the project. There's different ways that can happen, but we're focused on just like a mini core and everything else kind of coming out from there. So this is how we see a foundation kind of coming together. We recognize that a lot of projects are already inside of foundations, fiscal sponsors, but they need some of these other roles, these non-technical support roles, dedicated product teams, the ability for somebody to kind of enter into contracts on their behalf. So one of our projects is a member of a very well-known fiscal sponsor. And they have been offered, they have been asked by the World Bank if they can implement their software in multiple countries around the world. It's a very valuable piece of software, and into projects that could be $50 to $100 million. And now imagine you're an open source project, as we understand an open source project, and now someone's coming to you and saying, we have $100 million and we want this software to be implemented in every country, but yet you don't have a network of implementers yet. You don't have commercial entities who are out building, like who will enter into those contracts? Who will, and that's a lot of money. So so this is something that we're starting to build out. Like we need to be able to think big. We need to be able to interface with these large organizations that are making pretty substantial global investments. We do believe that open source can be the core of that, but they can't just go to the open source project. That's just not the nature of it. And so what we're trying to do is maintain the open source nature of a project by building an organization on top of it that is strong enough to be able to enter into these contractual relationships while maintaining the neutrality of the core project. So that's the vision that we're working towards. These are a number of the things that we feel should be inside of that organization. So the first is the Open Source Resource Center. This is something that we've already built. This is the thing that we've been running. We've got our budget up there. We think it's very, very valuable to have a support organization to do that. We do think that there needs to be some kind of a lab, mostly around ideas of interoperability. We have this project and this project. How can we get them to work together? How can we go out together and build kind of common value? We think our micro grants program is very good and can be a foundation for being able to move more significant amounts of money to feature development in digital public goods. But we also think that there's a role for multiple platforms. We do think that there is a role for volunteer platforms, for a platform for the micro grants, so we can have a backlog of all the fundable the backlog of a task list and have it organized in a way that somebody can come and find it, prioritize it, fund it. Even cloud infrastructure, is there a role for shared? We'll go into a lot more detail on why we think that's important to be able to have that shared. And the last is the ability to have managed core teams to be able to share them across projects and take advantage that way. So we're going to kind of go quickly through this. If you're actually interested in how we're kind of imagining setting up a foundation like this, love for you to kind of get in contact, send us an email, talk more about this. But we really we do see the creation of a membership organization, probably not a C6, probably a C3 or something similar, is very kind of important. But understanding that the primary members are actually those who are investing in the projects. They're not the projects themselves. So unlike a lot of foundations who rely on corporate members, we don't have a lot of corporate members. What we do have is the international development community, both donors and large NGOs, who may be invested in different digital projects, and so their participation in the foundation it would give them access to support for the investments that they're already making. And we do see that as the foundational source of funds for this initial organization. The digital public goods can also come in as members. We feel like most of them should come in as free members. Most of the projects are connected to some international donor or NGO who invested them initially. So they already do kind of have a connection to somebody who is a paying member, but they themselves would come in as free. And then for our other things, fiscal sponsor and primary maintainer, just kind of budgeting for that. So we have a menu of services that these projects could access through membership with us. We're also able to create essentially a sub-foundation or account for each project, similar to other software foundations, which would allow them to raise money, have memberships, even do some revenue generating activities. And these are the different things that we think that they can do. What we're working on for each digital public good is just kind of a minimal amount. We feel like targeting about $500,000 a year will keep each project independent. Again, these are big projects, so that might seem like a lot of money, but it really isn't, given how much money kind of flows to them to begin with. Membership commitments will be a big part of that. We're also looking to doing some advocacy for the donors to be able to find ways to give money in the long term, maybe even tying it to a percentage of implementations that they're also funding. But then some other revenue models for them as well, which might include consulting and SaaS versions, things that you might find in a common open source business model. The real trick here is in figuring out which things belong in a community project, which things are done by community members, which things are done by a foundation, and doing it in a way that maintains the collaborative, free nature of the project. So how can you get involved? We'd love to hear from you. First, just getting feedback on our project, on what we're doing. We'd love to hear from you. There are opportunities to volunteer. A number of the projects are looking for volunteers. We highly recommend the OVO platform. A number of our projects are already on there. Go check it out, find ways to contribute, volunteer. And then also join our forums. We'd love to kind of hear from you, hear your thoughts. If you know of projects or you are a project that you feel might be a digital public good that could be used for social good, we'd also love to hear from you. So I'm very happy to answer any questions, but that's the end of the core presentation. Thank you.